How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes. A millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: "Damn you, Steve." He was my husband. Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends, and the night before he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because you can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back up at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of the story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled off, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? Because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the no thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings are really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we spend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
So that's Dr. Brene Brown. She has one of her TED Talks is one of the most watched on the internet on vulnerability. And if you get a chance to watch it, I recommend it. So we started our sermon series a few weeks ago talking about emotional intelligence. And what she said here was directly pertinent to that. I said that emotional self-regulation is part of making our relationships better. Controlling those first impulses, that temper, the anger, the fight or flight reflex, the blame. So that was really the first week. Then we talked about, let's see, actually jump forward here. Then we talked about the second week about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, or the 4 relationship killers. And we talked about criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. I also shared with you a little bit else, some other things about this stuff that, ironically, surprisingly to some people, the more you complain to your spouse, which is different than criticism, the more you complain, meaning offering specific, talking about specific behaviors, the better your relationship is. The longer you're likely to be together. Complaint is different than criticism. I also talked about the magic ratio, 8-to-1. 8 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction. Typically in research, looking at couples, people who had 8 positive interactions to 1 negative stayed together. If it dropped much below that, they didn't stay together. So that's where we've been over the past couple of weeks. Today, we're talking about boundaries. I'm going to share with you some general principles that I hope will help you establish good, healthy boundaries. Boundaries are important, first, to establish a sense of self, that there's a difference between you and the world out there and other people. Having a good self-awareness is also part of emotional intelligence. Making relationship changes is the other thing we're going to talk about. In other words, if there's a toxic or abusive relationship, how to go about changing that. And finally, the importance of boundaries for intimacy. Because intimacy requires you to have a good sense of boundaries. Now, I'm riffing on some work by two Christian counselors, Townsend and McLeod, who have done a lot of books. There's boundaries in marriage, boundaries in parenting, boundaries, a variety of kinds. But if you want to read more, you could look at their stuff. I could do a whole sermon series on boundaries. I've got a lot of stuff I want to cover today, so just bear with me. I'm not going to hit everything, obviously, but I do think it's important when we're talking about relationships to talk about the importance of boundaries. So what is a boundary? Well, a boundary can be something as simple as a line on the ground. In games, it tells us what's fair play and what is foul. Also good for relationships. Boundaries tell us the rules of the road, where some people are allowed and where some people are not allowed. Who is allowed to go where? Boundaries mark spaces. It can be something as simple as a sign. Boundaries tell us what behaviors are forbidden, and they tell us what behaviors are permitted. It's good to watch the signs, otherwise you might be surprised. A good metaphor for boundaries, relationship boundaries, I think, is this picture right here. You see there are multiple boundaries here. There's a sidewalk is one boundary. Then there's the little strip of lawn. There's a picket fence. There's some more lawn. There's a porch. And then there's the house itself, right? And each of those is a boundary area. There are some people that I really don't want to come inside my fence, right? We'll stand out on the sidewalk and talk. Some people I'll let up on my porch. If I like you, I'll let you inside my house. Most of you have been inside my house. I haven't thrown anyone out yet, so that's good. Good for y'all. But this is a good example of boundaries, and our relationship boundaries work very much like this. We need boundaries to define ourselves. Your skin is a boundary. Your car is a boundary. There's a part of your brain, actually, that you can see light up that has its sole purpose is to help you have a sense of where you end and the world begins. Where you stop and the world begins. So that's an important boundary. So I'm going to share with you another important principle about boundaries. This is my first principle that I'm going to share with you. It is this: I am responsible for my own feelings, thoughts, attitudes, actions, stewardship of my time and resources, my goals, my happiness and fulfillment. I am responsible for these things. Only me. There's a corollary to this, of course, which is that I am responsible for no one else's thoughts, feelings, actions, stewardship, etc. I'm responsible for no one else's. I cannot be responsible for them. Now, it's interesting because our language betrays us here all the time. We say things like, "You made me so mad." But can someone else make you mad? I know, yes, they can, right? All right, I understand, right? But no, actually they can't. No one else can make you mad. Nobody can make me mad except me. How I think about something can make me mad. My irrational amygdala can stir up my stress response, but I choose to be mad. Now, someone may know how to push my buttons, but it's because I let them push my buttons. People say things like, "I'm mad because he's always late." Well, how does his lateness affect you? You could talk about how his lateness causes you stress and how your thinking about your stress causes you to feel. Well, he's wasting my time. No, he's not wasting your time. Only you can waste your time. You may be wasting your time dealing with him, but he cannot waste your time. Maybe you should have brought a book. No one can waste your time. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you get mad. Well, you were in a car and people are going to cut you off. When you get on the road, you accept that danger. Someone is going to cut you off. Just start when you get in the car and put your seatbelt on. Know that someone's going to cut you off. If you start with that attitude, you'll actually feel a lot better. This is just part of driving. I tell you, you really want to be stressed, you Americans complaining about people driving, go to Cairo and ride in a taxi. Oh my God, I don't care anymore. People cut me off. At least I'm alive, The only time in the Middle East people are always like, aren't you afraid to go to the Middle East? The only time I was afraid in the Middle East was in a taxi in Cairo. I thought, this is how I'm going to die. This is how I'm going to die. Everything after that's downhill. It's not a problem. We need these boundaries, and we need to take ownership of our thoughts and feelings, and we need to take responsibility for them, because this is part of what defines who we are. This stuff inside me, I'm responsible for. The stuff outside me, I am not responsible for. Okay? Likewise, there are things that are my problems, and then there are things that are not my problems. And a huge amount of our relationships could be better if we would simply recognize these differences. Now look, I can say this stuff, but I have yet to achieve the Zen Buddhist-like detachment that prevents me from losing my temper. Okay? My family can tell you this. The fact is, though, my feelings are mine, and I can't make anyone else responsible for them. Not my spouse, not my kids, not my friends, not my enemies, not my abusive parents, not my 6th grade teacher, and I'm still dealing with my childhood trauma. None of those people can make me feel any way that I don't choose to feel. Those feelings are mine, and they're my responsibility. And they don't excuse my actions either. People say things all the time. Well, she made me mad, so I hit her, or I yelled at her. That's abdication of the ownership of my actions. Actually, it's abdication of two things. It's abdication of my feelings and actions. I'm not a vending machine. Someone can't put a quarter in me and pull a lever and expect a reaction, okay? We have cerebral cortexes. We can think through things. Here's another principle. Boundaries define what you don't control. As Brené Brown was illustrating, the spilled coffee was no one's fault. That was gravity. Accidents happen. You can't make someone else be responsible. Now, people are always making other people responsible for their own happiness. Your spouse can't make you happy, and that's not your spouse's job. Your kids can't make you happy. It's not your spouse's job to make you feel fulfilled. You can't make your spouse feel fulfilled. And when we fail to acknowledge these boundaries, we actually wind up making things worse. We wind up resenting our spouse or resenting someone else because we can't make them happy. Now, this is something I've had to spend 20 years of marriage learning. It used to be, when I was younger, that when my wife was upset about something, I sometimes thought it was my responsibility to fix it. That never worked. It just made her mad. I mean, this is the classic example, right? A classic example is a married couple who aren't clear about what they want from each other. And spouse number one comes in and wants to vent about something that happened at work. My coworkers are such jerks. You won't believe what this woman said to me. She said blah, blah, blah. And spouse number two hears this, and they immediately shift into problem-solving mode. Right? Well, you should have said this to her. Oh, well, next time you should try this. Well, how have you thought about it this way? And spouse number one is thinking, this person's criticizing me. I'm bringing my problems, and they're getting on my case. And they get mad, and they respond harshly. Spouse number two can't understand why. Why did you tell me about your problems if you didn't want me to help? Right? And you get in this argument, and it's not even about anything. It's an argument about nothing. The biggest arguments I've ever had with my wife are about nothing. The worst argument I ever had with Angela was actually on the streets of Oxford. We were on a trip, and it was about Oxford, England. Yeah, not Oxford, Alabama. So maybe you should tell the story, because No, really. I mean, it was nuts, and it was about scheduling and time and frustrating, and I wasn't listening to her, and I was being a jerk, but it was over nothing. Those are always the worst arguments, because we're trying to be responsible for our other person, and we're not taking ownership of our own emotions. Now, for Christians, I think this becomes an issue because for us to do justice and love and kindness, sometimes we have to come to peace with the fact that we're not Jesus. And it isn't our job to save everybody. We're not responsible for everyone. Here's another example of someone's problem not being mine. I've been in the church business for a long time. I used to serve a small church on a country road in Cherokee County. And at least once or twice a week, someone would pull in off the highway, and they would come to the church office because they needed gas. All right? And it was almost invariably this story. I was at my mom's funeral in Kentucky, and we live in Florida, and I need gas to get home. And because I'm a Christian and I'm in a church, I'm supposed to give them money so they can get home. Now, hear me. It is important to help people in poverty, and it is important to help people in crisis, okay? But what I would often say is, wow, I'm sorry for your loss. It is really hard to lose a parent, and that's a shame. Next time you go on a long journey, though, you should probably figure out if you have enough fuel to get you back home. I know that sounds harsh, but the fact is, if you get in the car and you set off on a journey, getting there and back is your responsibility. Now, if you have a mechanical issue or there's something else, if it's an unavoidable issue, sure, I'll help. But it's your responsibility to figure out if you can get home. That's someone who's trying to make their crisis your crisis, and you're not helping when you rush in and try to solve that issue for somebody. Sometimes our helping actually hurts. And people would say, some Christian you are, and I'd say, Jesus didn't come to earth so that your lack of planning would become my responsibility. That's just being a grown-up. Now again, you can take this attitude too far and then you start blaming people for their poverty. But I think it's important before we step in there and try to rescue someone because we're experiencing discomfort at someone else's crisis, that we take a minute and actually think about what is the most loving thing to do in this situation. Now, I will also tell you that before, some people have stopped in and said they were having a crisis of getting somewhere, and I offered to drive them. I called their bluff. I said, okay, hop in my car, we'll go to Kentucky. I never had any takers. So it's important for us to think about when we go the second mile that we're actually going the second mile. And that we're not just trying to overcome our own internal feelings of discomfort facing a crisis. So boundaries in relationships may mean that if someone is habitually late, we may go to dinner without them. If someone will not do their share of housework, they may need to wash their own clothes. If someone will not respect our privacy or consent boundaries, we may need physical separation from them. If someone will not stick to a budget, they may need to bounce a few checks. So I think it's important in marriage or other close relationships that nobody do these things unilaterally, all right? That isn't you're punishing people. You're not being mean. We need to be very clear about what our boundaries are. I need to qualify them with this other principle, okay? You cannot put boundaries on another person. Oh, I've gotten behind in my slides. Let me jump forward here. You cannot put boundaries. You cannot make boundaries for another person. You cannot set boundaries on another person. Oftentimes when we talk about boundaries, people think, oh, I need to set some boundaries on my spouse. No! You set the boundaries on you. You can only be responsible for your own boundaries. So what you do is you tell someone that their behavior or situation is a problem. And this is how I feel when you do this behavior. This is the change I would like to see. We talked about this 2 weeks ago with complaints. In fact, the best way to give someone a complaint is to give them 5 things you love about them before you tell them what you would like to change. So, for example, sweetheart, you are such a great mother. You take care of our kids so well. You're just the right amount of discipline and leniency. I'm so thankful that you help balance our checkbook. I'm so grateful for the way that you show assertiveness when dealing with your coworkers. You have a great sense of style, and you smell terrific. All right? I would like it in the future if you would hang up your towel when you're done with your shower. See? I mean, look, the whole idea is you're not doing this in a mean way. You're establishing some boundaries. Right? And if the towel doesn't get hung up, maybe that person has to do the laundry. I mean, these are some basic concepts. So when we talk about boundaries this way, people think of them as negative things, but they aren't negative. Boundaries are not threats. They're realistic assessments of our own finitude, that we cannot do everything. You are a finite being. You have a finite amount of time on this earth. You have a finite amount of resources. And we've got a finite amount of time to figure out how to live together and set gracious boundaries. So we can be partners in this enterprise and help each other to flourish, or we can ignore boundaries and hurt ourselves and each other. So you cannot make boundaries for another person. Now, I met with a woman a while back who wanted my advice on how to deal with her father. She told me that her father had always been very critical, and as a little girl, she had a passion for art. She was an artist, and even now as a grown woman pursuing art as her hobby, her father would say things that were demeaning and mocked her. And she was distressed because she felt like she was supposed to love her father, but she had such a hard time. Her father was a jerk. She didn't feel like she could love him. And he had been so abusive, she didn't like being around him. So she asked me what I thought she should do. Now, as a preacher, I try to qualify most of what I say. I'm not one of these guys who thinks he's Moses. Like, I'm bringing God's 10 Commandments to you to tell you how you should live, okay? I seldom do that. But this is one thing I want to tell you, and you can file this in, like, God wrote this with a finger on tablets. Just not really, but close, all right? This, I think, is a principle everyone needs to understand. You are under no ethical obligation to subject yourself to toxic or abusive relationships. None. Now, I say that, I need to establish a corollary. It's not always your fault if you can't, all right? But you are under no ethical obligation to subject yourself to these kinds of relationships. It's unfortunate that I even have to say this, but there's a strain of abusive and toxic Christianity that has been around for 100 years or more that tells you should stay in abusive relationships because God hates divorce. All right? So I have to say, I could spend a whole sermon talking about domestic abuse. These are resources if you think you might be in an abusive relationship. National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Alabama Coalition Against Domestic Violence, those websites. If you know someone in trouble, you can refer them there. I can't go into abusive relationships. I just need to tell you, you have no Christian obligation to stay in a relationship that's abusive or toxic. And here's a clarifying question you can ask. Would you accept this behavior from anyone else? So what I asked this woman is, would you accept this behavior, the way your father is treating you? Would you accept that from your husband? Would you accept that from your kids or your siblings? And she said no. That's a clue that you might be in a toxic relationship. And maybe you need to set some boundaries on that relationship. So, again, it's difficult that I have to say this thing, partially because there's all these scriptures in the Bible, in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, where Jesus says, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. If someone asks for your coat, give them your cloak. Or asks you for your cloak, give them your coat. Give them your shirt off the back. If someone asks you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. And Jesus does say those things. Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Those are all true. In the same Sermon on the Mount, 1 chapter later, Jesus also says this, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them underfoot and turn and maul you. We don't say that one enough. Now, there's 2 ways to interpret this passage. One is the gentle, generous way, which is that Jesus is saying, look, don't always wear your heart on your sleeve. Don't try to, waste your time with people who don't really want you around. You'll just annoy them. Okay, that's one way to interpret it. I think the more offensive way to interpret it is probably closer to accurate. In other words, Jesus uses the words dogs and pigs, which in the ancient Middle East and the current Middle East are fighting words. You know, you call someone a dog in the United States, no one cares, right? You dog, you cur, oh, don't hurt me, right? Right? So we have a different way of saying that. We call someone a son of a bitch, which is a dog. That's pretty offensive, right? I mean, it's pretty remarkable that Jesus would say, now, I know Jesus loves everybody, God loves everybody, Jesus wants everyone saved, I totally believe this, but for your purposes, there are people you do not need to be wasting your time with, they only will hurt you. And we need to recognize this fact. So boundaries are important for distinguishing where you're going to spend your time in relationships. You don't have enough time in your life to deal with people who are going to trash your most precious treasures. Next principle, boundaries help create intimacy. Here's the wonderful thing about boundaries. When you have a gate or you have a house, you have gates. When you have a fence, you have a gate. If you have a house, you have a door. The whole point is it keeps bad things out and lets good things in, right? Your guests can come in. People you want in your life can come in. People you don't want in your life have to stay out. There are more than one time I've been at home and a salesman would come and knock on my door and they would try to get their foot in the door, literally, and they would also say, "Can I come in and use your bathroom?" Right? Which is their way of trying to get in your house. And I was really kind of creeped out by this. And so when someone says that, I say, "No, you can go into my yard. I'll talk to you in my yard." Right? If someone doesn't respect your boundaries, you need to push them out. But that gate is also there for people you like to come in. I love having people over at our house. We did that last week. We had a party at our house. It was wonderful to have my friends there. It was a wonderful time. And what happens is when we let people in, when we share our resources with them, when we share our lives with them, we develop a sense of intimacy. And it's one reason we need boundaries. We share our hopes and dreams with each other. We share our fears with each other. If I tell you about that thing I did in second grade that I still feel guilty about, we have a bond now. There's a sense of intimacy. And if I tell you something I've never told anyone else, that's even a deeper sense of intimacy. As a preacher, I don't live in a fishbowl the way I did in a small town, but we still live very public lives. Many of you have been in our home. I want to be a generous, gregarious person who lives a transparent life. But I'm not going to cross the TMI line. For example, I talked to my wife before I shared that story with you because that would be TMI if she didn't want me to share that, right? That's something between us. That's too much information if I share it broadly. That's one of the reasons gossip is so toxic. So boundaries have windows and doors. Sometimes we let people look in at our lives, but we don't let them enter. And sometimes we invite people into them. Now, this is where people get in trouble in marriages. So, several times I've talked to people who have had situations of infidelity in their lives. And in a straight marriage, when a man has a problem with his wife, and he doesn't complain to his wife in the appropriate way so that they can work on their problems together, he turns and goes to his opposite sex coworker and complains to her. Now he's shared something with her that he hasn't shared with his wife, and now he's set up to create intimacy that he doesn't share with his wife. That's called, opening the door to adultery. They say if your brakes are bad, don't park on a hill. Don't invite that intimacy into your life that you don't share with your partner, whoever you are. Those doors and windows, as soon as you open it to someone else and you close it to your partner or your spouse, you've opened up a gateway to intimacy with them that you don't share with your spouse. Now, I know sometimes we have secrets and we talk about things with our friends and whatnot. I really think it's a serious issue. That if you are doing that, you're probably not being aware of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: the criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. You're stonewalling your spouse or your partner. And you need to be having that conversation with them. The same thing is true for regular gossip between friends. Folks, if you've got a problem with someone, you need to tell that person. You don't go and tell someone else. That's failure of boundaries. And sometimes if boundaries of fidelity have been violated, marriages can be salvaged, but it takes time and work to rebuild trust. So we're going to talk about trust in a couple of weeks, but those boundaries around marriage can be rebuilt and made stronger if people will simply follow those rules. As I said, I think Christians especially have to work to undo damage of centuries of toxic and abusive theology. Gracious boundaries are an important part of good relationships with everyone, and especially with having a firm foundation in yourself to own your own feelings, to be honest about what you want and need. And I think prayer helps us establish those boundaries. I think when you spend time with God and you pray to God and you pray about relationships, I think God helps you establish those boundaries to help you see what you need to do. Boundaries actually give you the freedom to love as a more self-aware person. Because you have the freedom to say no to some people, because you put boundaries on your time, that means your yes is so much more valuable. And you're able to give your energy to things you really care about. So one last image. I don't think it's coincidence that in the Hebrew Bible, when God tells the Hebrews to build a temple, that it's built in this sort of concentric rectangle situation. Okay, so there was the camp, there was the place everybody lived, and then there was the tabernacle inside, and the tabernacle had a big curtain wall around it. That was the courtyard. And you had to prepare yourself before you could come into the courtyard. You had to become ritually pure before you could come into the courtyard, right? And then there was a section in there, the temple. And only priests and other certain qualified people could come in the temple. And inside that temple, there was the Holy of Holies. And only one person went in there once a year. I think our lives are meant to be series of concentric boundaries. And it's important to have those clear senses of boundaries so that we can have a worshipful, spiritual attitude toward the world. And I really think this helps us to love people better. Boundaries are not just about shutting people out. They're about helping us to be secure in ourselves so that we can love fully. I think it took our ancestors thousands of years to learn these lessons. And I think every one of us has to go through a process of learning how to create them. So I've talked a lot about boundaries today. I've given you sort of three general themes about boundaries. Boundaries to create a sense of self. Boundaries to help you cut off abusive or toxic relationships. And boundaries to help you develop a sense of intimacy. I think all of those are important. And we talk about Jesus being a boundary breaker, about crossing boundaries and reaching beyond. I think that's super important, but you realize those boundaries were established first? Because I think without a clear sense of self, I think a lot of times if we have those fuzzy boundaries and we don't establish criteria for how we let people treat us and for the ownership of our own feelings and not owning other people's feelings, I think oftentimes that becomes toxic and it impedes us from loving other people. We wind up resenting them. We wind up not loving them as God would love, as God would want us to love. Self-giving, self-pouring out love. And so it was within a room that Jesus gathered with his 12 disciples on that night in which he gave himself up for us. And he took bread, and he blessed it, and then he broke the bread and he gave it to his disciples in self-giving love and said, "Take and eat. This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And when the supper was over, he took the cup. He gave it to his disciples and he said, "Drink from this, each of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me." And so, in remembrance of these, your mighty acts in Jesus Christ, we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, in union with Christ's offering for us. Pour out your Holy Spirit on us gathered here and on these gifts of bread and wine. Make them be for us the body and blood of Christ, that we may be for the world the body of Christ, redeemed by his blood. Make us one with Christ, one with each other, and one in ministry to all the world until Christ comes in final victory and we feast at his heavenly banquet. Amen.